For a lot of gamers my age, the indie scene is where that spark of creativity that we fell in love with growing up can still be found. That's not to say that the AAA scene is completely creatively bankrupt. I fell hard for Sekiro last year, and if I ever get good enough to want to show you all my gameplay, I might actually cover it on here one day. I also spent a good amount of the Christmas holiday this year playing various entries in a certain long-running survival horror series that I'll no doubt be making numerous callbacks to this entire video. But so much has changed over the last couple of decades, and investors expect so much more money out of the games they fund that risk-taking and innovation has given way to iterating on established ideas, following trends, and straight up copying what other developers did. 2023 has a really impressive game lineup for sure, but so many of the AAA offerings are sequels in long-running series or remakes following the success of Capcom's RE2 remake. The PS1 and PS2 era was the frontier of 3D gaming. Norms hadn't been established and safe wasn't something we really understood or cared for in the face of exciting new experimental ideas. But more so than that, what these consoles had was limitations and restrictions. Yes, big studios were still investing hard in their new products, and were expecting more money back. And E.T. on the Atari 2600 proves beyond doubt that there's nothing new about unbridled greed in this medium, only that we haven't learned a damn thing since that disaster nearly ended home console gaming before it even began 40 years ago. The hardware, however, was where belts had to be tightened, and creative solutions had to be found to work around difficult problems. One of the most iconic of these was Capcom's production of Resident Evil, and their use of relatively low-res pre-rendered backgrounds, an idea taken and refined from Alone in the Dark, to create dramatic camera angles and hide things that would scare the player just beyond their view. They combined this with room-to-room loading scenes that, while a little annoying, were pretty damn immersive overall. This unique blend of visual design and gameplay mechanics is what formed the first survival horror experience, which is what brings us to the subject of today's conversation. Indie studios lack the size and budget of their AAA counterparts, which means expectations have to be checked when planning any kind of development. I'm a hobbyist game dev myself, which is something that came about after retiring from the Fallout 4 and Skyrim modding scene. And let me tell you, even in the world of mods, where things like concepting a gameplay loop or making an entire game's worth of 3D models and animations are already taken care of, I can tell you that the mod graveyard is full of overly ambitious projects that failed because of a lack of understanding of just how much work goes into creating even the simplest games. And yes, quite a few of my own ideas are in there as well. And let's be real here too. The indie scene isn't this final bastion of untouched beauty in the gaming world. Steam publishing in early access has led to all kinds of broken promises and low-effort games or straight-up soulless asset flips being made as quick cash grabs. As such, if an indie studio, lacking the marketing budget and clout of a big publisher, wants to get their game noticed, they've got to be offering something pretty damn special. So for Rose Engine, what is essentially a two-person team, the task of getting their game finished and then getting it noticed by the right people meant having a clear idea of their goals, themes, mechanics, and core gameplay. The game would need a powerful, unifying aesthetic, as well as visuals and sound design that matched the tone of their narrative, and it would need to be one hell of a story that could be explored almost exclusively through gameplay to eliminate the need for expensive cinematic cutscenes and professional voice acting. So, did they succeed? Well, I probably wouldn't be here talking about it if they hadn't. So why don't we take a deep dive and see if we can't answer the question, do androids dream of electric hell? This is Signalis. The story of Signalis is something best uncovered through play. Or rather, it is something better discovered for yourself than explained to you by someone else. It calls to mind my all-time favourite horror book, House of Leaves. I read this for the first time in the summer of 2022, and on the recommendation of my friend, I didn't read anything about it prior to picking it up. That's a big ask, I know, but both House of Leaves and Signalis are labyrinths that need to be explored and uncovered little by little in order to get the most powerful effect out of them. In both cases, the story you form in your own head about these events and just how much of it, if any at all, actually happened, will be just as valid as anyone else's interpretation of it. There is going to be a spoiler section in this video towards the end, where I'll talk about some of the late game revelations, so if you haven't played this game already, then I'm pleading with you to skip that and every other video or discussion on the topic of the game's plot until you've at least played through it once. While I will be discussing some of the facts in the case of Signalis, I won't be telling you what my headcanon or personal experience was because, well, that's mine I'm afraid to say, and it's too precious for me to share with anyone at the moment. Maybe one day, but not today. Just know that I consider all of your experiences and thoughts on this to be just as valid as mine. So when I first heard about this game thanks to Avalanche Reviews covering first the demo and then the full game on his channel, I was getting Resident Evil in space vibes, with maybe a little cosmic horror thrown in to spice up the old virus that made everyone mad scenario. This was a prospect I found very enticing. For our basic setup, we've got what seems to be some kind of mining facility run by a totalitarian government on a frozen moon called Leng, somewhere far from our own star system in deep space. This place, and others like it, are stacked with a combination of Gestalt workers and replicas, the former being full humans born and raised like any other, and the latter being manufactured androids on a par with Blade Runner's Nexus 6 skin jobs, complete with implanted memories and pseudo-personalities.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
At the start of the game, we take control of one such replica, a Land Survey Ship Technician replica, or Elster for short. She wakes from what looks like some kind of hibernation pod on a spaceship, and after a little exploration, she quickly learns that the ship has crashed on some kind of frozen wasteland, and that the Gestalt pilot, a girl named Ariane, has seemingly left the ship and gone out into this inhospitable looking world. Right from the start though, it's very clear that we have no concept of when these events actually happened. We could of course assume that the emergency landing triggered the awakening of Elster, and that Ariane left only a matter of minutes ago. But then, why did she leave? Why didn't she wait for Elster? What if something had malfunctioned and Elster had awoken hours, months, or even centuries after the impact? Regardless, she begins her trek through the snow and down into the bowels of the planet, where things start to get very weird indeed. And it's about here, as we see Elster staring into a mirror in the bathroom of the Sierpinski 23 mining facility, that it really hits home. Far from playing Resident Evil in space, this is Silent Hill in space. Replicas are a wonder of a kind of special psychic power that exists within Signalis' world, known as bioresonance. What exactly this is kept vague at best, and diving too deep into it will lead us into spoiler territory and the ever-deepening rabbit hole of speculation that now surrounds this game. Calling it psychic power may be one hell of an understatement, but for the purpose of this part of the video, it'll suffice. As far as replicas are concerned, bioresonance is used to map personalities onto them by essentially copying the brain pattern of a gestalt and pasting it into whatever constitutes a replica's grey matter. This pattern is, however, doctored to block up memories while keeping useful personality traits to create a mostly obedient worker class, and likely also to stop replicas from getting the idea that they're overall better than the people who made them and having a revolution of their own. About the facility, there are various burn after reading type documents to be found that give strict instructions on how replicas should be treated and what is required of them in order to prevent memories from resurfacing. Some replicas, for example, have to keep journals, while others can be subdued with fetish items to fascinate them while they're in their downtime. Much like with magic in a lot of fantasy, the reliance on bioresonance, a power that belongs to only a select few, has stunted the development of technology, creating a very haves and have-nots society that has access to highly advanced androids but still uses VCRs and analog radio. Replicas all have their own very specific purpose, such as the Fulca units that operate as commanders for Protectorate forces, and thanks to being implanted with certain bioresonant abilities, are an absolute authority among replicas. This is, however, putting a lot, if not all of their eggs in one basket, because when a Fulka unit goes bad, things start to fall apart quickly. The horror in the Sierpinski facility began when their Fulka crossed some kind of threshold found either within the facility or somewhere on the planet. It could be either or both. And after returning without explaining what she saw there, soon succumbed to some kind of sickness. I'm being as vague as possible here for those who haven't played it, but whatever this sickness was, it seemed to spread out from there and infect almost everyone in the facility. The Gestalt workers more or less dissolved into nothing, and their silhouettes can be found around the place, while the replica's superior regenerative abilities and cybernetic components were affected differently, seemingly succumbing to a kind of violent madness and basically becoming space zombies for the purpose of the game. The affliction dulls their senses, meaning someone can sneak by them pretty easily, but the moment replicas become aware of them, they alert everything in the area and home in with murderous intent. Get used to that noise. So we as Elster have to descend through the various levels of the facility, interact with the few sane people left, and search for Ariane. Fortunately or unfortunately though, things are much stranger than they initially seem. For example, our brief interactions with this Adler, a replica that functions as a kind of second in command for the facility, sees him spouting off about some kind of reality-breaking time loop. Items we can find seem to suck us into memories of someone else's life, yet things we find there stay in our inventories. And an entire section of the map is just called Nowhere, and seems to be made of decayed versions of other rooms we've previously visited, and areas engulfed in flesh and biological matter. So, what the hell is any of this? Are we dealing with parallel dimensions, broken timelines, or is this maybe some personal hell like James Sunderland finds himself in? Well, that's for you to discover, I'm afraid. I'll be talking about late game information in the spoiler section, but even then, how you interpret that and what it all means to you in the end is entirely up to you. Signalis in many ways communicates its story just as much by what it doesn't say as what it does. The game isn't interested in beating you over the head with its backstory and world. All that information is there if you're prepared to take the time to look around and connect a lot of dots, but there's no exposition character here to explain to the stupidest person in the room what the plot is, or why the world is the way it is. Elster is a replica, and since she hasn't succumbed to any kind of memory loss, it's assumed she already has all the information on the state of the universe and her place in it, and so doesn't need to have that explained to her at length in some drawn out cutscene that will have us all wondering when the game will restart and we'll actually be able to get back to playing it. There are plenty of documents to read, and a few characters to talk to here and there that will feed you tidbits of information, but it's all somewhat disjointed. The conversations you have remind me a lot of Silent Hill, with characters speaking in cryptic riddles or only putting forward the most basic of information about themselves, their experiences, or their purposes here. There are two big aha moments with documents you read before and after the final boss, but you're still probably going to need to reread the majority of the documents you found after you've uncovered those, and maybe replay the game a couple of times before you have some kind of solid idea of what's going on and how much, if any of this, is really happening. That being said, similar to the experience of playing as James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2, a lot of people have their own feelings about the deeper meaning of these events, and even what constitutes the canon ending. There are lengthy Reddit threads and Discord conversations on the subject of what is actually happening here, and I think there are also examples of people finding larger meanings in things that weren't intended by the developers. That's not to say that their interpretation is wrong, just that this kind of narrative is something quite personal, and so much of that comes from just how much of it is left out. Now, of course there are practical reasons for this too. Voice acting, for example, is quite the expensive prospect when compared to simple text boxes that deliver the information with this odd little retro computer sound effect. We've talked before about how the use of professional voice actors really changed gaming in my videos on the Legacy of Kain series, and we've only got to look at the classic Resident Evil games to see that, while it doesn't exactly ruin an experience, it does take away from the overall immersion if the voices are bad.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
But there's a couple of things to consider here. Like, how do we know this isn't just the way replicas communicate with each other when there aren't any gestalts around? Maybe it's just more efficient for them to do it this way. More importantly though, voices would break the almost oppressive silence that permeates so much of this game. When it comes to horror, there may be no single more important thing than good sound design, and Signalis has a great OST that really sells its atmosphere. Even from those first jarring tones we hear at the start of the game, we get a sense of something off, something wrong. But so much of the opening minutes of the game is almost silent. It feels as if we're simply hearing the hum of some powerful engine deep in the core of this facility, still keeping the lights on even after everything else has gone to hell. Looking through my footage, I don't even encounter an enemy for the first 23 minutes of the game. The whole thing is just gradually building suspense as we move Elster around this incredibly quiet facility that should be teeming with life, while a gathering sense of dread builds up as we see bodies lying on the floor, encounter injured replicas who have little to say other than to warn us away from here, and find documents that paint a very dark picture of just what life is like here on a regular day. I'd call this quite bold. The attention spans of people can be very short in the world of TikTok and YouTube shorts, so to really take time to build atmosphere and suspense takes a lot of courage, and there's no doubt in my mind that it pays off really well in this game. When the enemies do start standing up though, the music doesn't disappoint there either. Drawing inspiration from Silent Hill, we are at once assaulted with industrial clanging and sounds that seem more like some large, powerful machine churning something up than actual music. Combined with the screeches of the replicas as they home on you, it really serves to raise your pulse and bring you into a full alert state to either stand your ground and fight, or run like hell back to your safe room and pick up a bigger gun. So, as important as sound and silence are in horror, we also need to look at the visuals. Signalis rocks an awesome PlayStation 1 aesthetic that, as well as being a great homage to the era of games that inspired it, was also probably something of a practical choice. Art is easily one of the most expensive parts of any game. It can also be very time consuming. If you look at the level of detail on the character models and scenery of something like the Callisto Protocol, to use another recent space horror example, it starts to make sense why such large teams are needed to put all this together, especially because they can be changing the layout and design of areas daily, and even scrapping months of work to start fresh with something new. Now, those last 2 points are unfortunate realities of the world of game design. You can design a cool room with a puzzle, but once you've connected that room to a corridor, maybe with another room that hides important information or a key for that puzzle, you might find yourself wanting to move things around a little to create variety or allow for some new idea you've had. Connect all that further still into an entire game's worth of rooms, and you might feel the need to make yet more changes, meaning it won't be long before you have a room that looks nothing like how you started, or even just gets cut completely because it messes with the flow of the player through the environment. So, when you've only got 2 people working on a project, you probably aren't going to be spending hours creating ultra-realistic props if there's a chance they aren't even going to make it to the final cut. More importantly though, while there probably is a version of the story and experience that will work with top-of-the-line graphics, these highly stylized visuals and the top-down camera just work so well with the rest of this story. This game's visuals are displayed in dreary and depressing low lights that would seem perfectly fitting even when this place is operating at full capacity, and only serves to make these dark corridors full of things that want to kill us all the more unsettling. Early on, for example, we find these dimly lit bunks that seem more like individual prison cells than places of rest for the Gestalt workers that allude to just how comfortable working in this facility really is. Then there's the interrogation room, which... do I really need to comment on this one? There are other areas damaged by flooding and filled with disgusting dark water, and later we start to see environments covered in raw flesh that pulses and beats as if something is being pumped through it. All of this is done through relatively low resolution texture maps and very simple specular lighting. The edges display jagged pixel lines while character models lack faces, and even animations have this unnerving, dull-like quality to them. It all serves to make the game oh so much more creepy, and helps to keep that oppressive atmosphere all the way through, even as our arsenal and health resources gain in power and size. Even the user interface has been crafted with this in mind. The colours are all somewhat washed out, and there's a kind of screen filter and the constant humming of some ancient TV, like we're looking at this on a Sega Game Gear or Atari Lynx, as we search through our inventory or cycle through radio frequencies, looking for some clue to a puzzle or something. The last place that Signalis really communicates its world is through the few NPCs that we meet and the many documents scattered around the various locations we visit on our mission. I've already mentioned the characters and their odd dialogue that doesn't seem to match the rest of the scene. There's also this one girl called Issa, who seems to be the protagonist in her own adventure similar to ours. We bump into her at several points in the game. I won't say too much on her as, again, spoilers, but I got mad Lisa Garland vibes with her. The documents that we can find describe in a disjointed way the situation with the worlds in this star system, revealing the story of a powerful empire ruled by an empress revered almost like a goddess, and possibly possessed of bioresonance so strong she can literally bend the fabric of reality. We learn about a rebellion that broke away from this seemingly oppressive rule to form its own government, and an ongoing war that still rages with replicas being pivotal in this fight, while this new totalitarian regime tries to raise its gestalts to be nothing more than mindless worker bees, controlling what books they can read, discouraging artistic pursuits, and assigning people to work roles versus letting them choose their own paths in life. We find various propaganda posters scattered all around, along with detailed information on each type of replica and how they are supposed to be handled in order to prevent their gestalt memories from resurfacing and keep them docile and subservient. On top of that, we find journal entries referring to old superstitions and a red eye that stares down from above, hinting at something far fouler and more menacing at play in the universe. All told, this presentation is one hell of a concoction, offering up numerous homages to the various media that came before it and inspired it, while being an incredibly practical solution to the problem of telling a large story with only minimal resources. I could call Signalis top-down Resident Evil and leave it at that, but I feel like I'd be doing the game a massive injustice. I mean, yes, Signalis brings all those elements of classic survival horror together and is very much a love letter to its forebears, but it is by no means a simple one-to-one comparison with a minor twist. After all, we could take a boomer shooter and a modern-style military shooter and see that they are made of basically the same ingredients, but the way those ingredients are arranged and the strength of some versus others is what makes one experience unique to the other. So, let's try to make sense of it all. We'll strip it down, look at all the pieces, and try to figure out how they all go together. Now, game genres are fairly muddy terms at the best of times, but I personally think that the overall player experience is what fits a game into a genre versus any particular collection of mechanics or what camera perspective they use. In the case of survival horror, I view these two words as descriptors. The first one of these is survival, so survival game mechanics, such as hard limitations on just about everything. For example, a limited total amount of ammunition, health pickups, and severely limited inventory space. The goal is to create a situation where people are forced to go rummaging through every nook and cranny in an area, as if they were desperately attempting to gather and store resources in order to survive an incredibly dangerous situation. In the process, they will be met with a lot of hard choices about which items to pick up and which to come back for later. At the very heart of this exploration is the save room, and the ones in Signalis are wonderful little bastions of respite, where you can take a minute to catch your breath, wipe the sweat from your brow, unload your inventory into your magic storage box, spend a few minutes thinking about what you need to take out with you on your next outing into the dark, while enjoying some of the game's more chill, lo-fi beats. Before tooling up as minimally as possible and heading out to pick up those items you left behind on your last run, or performing the gut-wrenching task of venturing into uncharted territory and whatever awaits you within. This brings us to the second descriptor of horror, Horror is a thematic term that's used in other media, and is pretty broad overall in what it can mean. You might, for example, want to classify horror as something scary, but I think that's far too subjective. A roller coaster is scary, but I wouldn't call it horror because for me, they're pretty damn exciting. Horror draws on some collective ideas about the nature of the universe, life, death, and that greatest of all mysteries, what is beyond even that. A game doesn't exactly have to have monsters to be horror, as the demo for the upcoming indie horror game Conscript shows us, but it does need to disempower the player, create a sense that they are more or less lost and alone, and surrounded by oppressive forces that, even individually, are far more dangerous than our player, and collectively, a nightmare to deal with. Signalis mostly achieves this goal. A massive part of this is in its sound design, lighting and visual aesthetic choices, to say nothing of its story that has you second guessing with every step you take. The blocky PS1 graphics work to create a bizarre and somewhat unnerving image of the various replica enemies that we see stalking the halls, acting out actions buried somewhere in their decayed memories, or staring into mirrors, as if trying to pull some thought of who they were from the depths of what remains of them. Traditionally, enemies in survival horror are very spongy, and usually only come at you in ones or twos, at least in the early game. The zombies in RE1 Remake can soak up half a clip of pistol ammunition before going down, and even then, they don't always stay that way. This creates an incentive to avoid combat as much as possible, to conserve resources for more dangerous enemies later. In Signalis though, early game enemies, such as these Yules we see around the halls of the Sierpinski facility, only take a few of our very plentiful handgun bullets to be knocked down, and a good Silent Hill stomp finishes them off pretty quick after that. So, what's the catch? Well, they have a tendency to get back up after a certain amount of time has passed. As one of the documents explains, the odd cancerous growths found on a lot of the recently deactivated replicas seem to be able to reactivate the entire unit, even after several hours of being shut down. To offset this, a very limited number of flares that can be carried in your inventory or fired from a flare gun are available to burn up all the organic matter on a replica and prevent it from getting back up. This is something of a callback to the RE1 remake, where zombies had to either be decapitated or burnt up in order to prevent them from mutating further into the tougher Crimson Head variety, and getting back up to cause you a lot more trouble than they previously had. And it's something I'd like to see pop up in a few more survival horror games if at all possible. The flares are the only way you can truly clear an area of enemies, so you have to make very tactical decisions about where to fight and when to run, which weapons are going to be best suited to each situation, and especially where you want to use these flares to create safe spaces for you to move through, something that on a first playthrough can be very difficult to figure out. And since we're talking about dealing with enemies, I guess we should talk about the combat. Well, first let's talk stealth. One notice you find early in the game mentions that infected replicas have their sense of sight and hearing severely impaired, meaning that it's possible for you to move slowly through areas with many enemies and not be noticed at all, which in and of itself can create some pretty tense moments. However, as soon as you're spotted, you'll know about it, and so will everything else in the room for that matter, and from there it's fight or flight time. Being a top-down game, Signalis has its own take on the survival horror combat formula, which generally involves holding one button to aim your weapon and another to fire it. As always, aiming will freeze you in place, and in this game will bring up a targeting reticle to highlight which enemy you're aiming at. The longer you're holding aim, the smaller the reticle gets, implying Elster is homing in on that oh so important headshot, and attacking when it's smaller will deal significantly more damage, saving you bullets for later. This is mostly fine, though in a pinch I often found my targeting reticle skipping between different enemies, or let's say for example I wanted to pick off a larger enemy first, maybe with a flare gun round to finish them off permanently before getting mobbed by the other replicas. I found it very difficult to land that level of precision. Now, that's not entirely uncommon in classic survival horror, but it is annoying if I feel I've come up with some clever strategy to clear out an area of enemies, and I keep getting reticle blocked on that first important hit. So hopefully you're seeing how the survival and horror elements are coming together nicely, and in a way that is somewhat unique to this game. But it's not without its problems, and a big one is the inventory. From the early game, the rule of 6 is laid down by the totalitarian government that runs this place. Also, Elster has a very small side pack that, presumably, is where she keeps all her stuff. So, before I start complaining, let's be clear. I started playing survival horror with the first Resident Evil. Chris was my guy, and Chris can only carry 6 items. So while we have definitely been a little spoiled with the RE Engine game's expandable inventories, I know that a 6-item inventory is perfectly fine, and I'm straight up telling you that it is not enough in Signalis. This all ties into what I consider to be the final and maybe most important element of survival horror: the level design. Survival horror games generally take place in isolated enclosed areas that are explored in laps. What that means is you'll probably start having access to only a very small area of the map, but by exploring you'll find keys and items that need to be transported to another room and used to unlock other areas. This is connected to the limited inventory feature and creates those hard decisions about what to take and what to leave for later when venturing out of a safe room. The balancing act here is bringing weapons and ammunition, health items, key items for puzzles, and still having a couple of spaces free for anything you might stumble into as you're exploring. It's a hard balancing act, as you could, for example, leave the health items, but then if you do find yourself overwhelmed and in a lot of trouble, you might not be able to make it back to your safe room and end up losing all of your gameplay from your last save. This is where level design is really important, because while you want to challenge your players, you don't want to frustrate them. Take the ground floor of the Spencer estate for an example. Safe rooms are here and here, meaning that you're actually never too far from one of your item boxes, so showing up at a puzzle without the key item in question isn't all that devastating, providing you can navigate the dangers to the nearest safe room. In Signalis, there were numerous times in both my playthroughs that I decided it was better to break my immersion and simply reload my last save, than go back the way I came and collect the item I needed, and then return once again back to the lock. There was less of this on my second playthrough, which is as it should be, I guess, but I think I can lay most of the issues on these items right here. This optical implant, this torch, and these extra weapons all need to have their own slots. The optical implant is a cool little implant that lets you basically take screenshots of puzzle clues so we can look back at them later when trying to solve the puzzles they are related to. This is a real handy little mechanic, and Silent Hill with its various cryptic riddles needed something like this. However, I'd say first that any image snapped with this should be stored in Elster's memory with the other documents, not within the eye itself. Likewise, this is something that should be installed into Elster, not carried around in her knapsack. The torch is also important for exploring dark rooms, especially because doors won't open in them even if you know where they are. Again though, Elster isn't carrying this in her bag. It seems to be shoulder mounted, so there's no reason this should take up any inventory space. Shock prods and flares for burning up bodies also need their own special slot. Sure, only give us the one that's equipped as a freebie, and make us carry the others, but these kinds of weapons exist in Resident Evil Remake and have their own special slot. Likewise, Chris always carries his lighter with him, which helps to ease the burden of preparing to destroy bodies. I'm not saying let us tool up like a walking tank, but one extra slot for the camera or torch, and one extra slot for the RB weapon, and then if we want to take any of the others, that's on us. The whole experience would be much smoother like this, and I'd be more incentivized to bring and use all these tools that the two developers worked so hard to implement into their game. So, back to the good stuff. Signalis' puzzles range from fine to great. There's plenty of basic keycards to find, but I especially enjoyed all the puzzles related to the shortwave radio, using it to either find codes or broadcast music or some other signal that would unlock something somewhere else. Some of these also make use of Signalis' esoteric storytelling, such as finding items in memories that can be used in the game world. There are quite a few head scratchers here too. Some require the use of basic math, a skill I have long since forgotten how to apply to anything but time and money, or where the answer may have been buried in a document that I only skim-read prior. There were a couple where I was actually stumped for quite a while before the solution came to me, or where the answer was staring me in the face and I'd missed it and gone running off back around the map to find something that wasn't there. So there's plenty of challenge to be had there as well. So while the package does have a few shortcomings, this is an excellent example of taking something old and familiar and remixing it into something new and exciting. And it really shows just how much love and passion Rose Engine have for both their own game and the entire survival horror genre. So, if this is on in the background or for some other reason you didn't read the title card, here I'm just going to say one more time that we are entering heavy spoiler territory, and you are doing yourself a disservice by sticking around if you haven't at least finished one full playthrough of this game. I know you've probably made up your mind one way or the other at this point, but I would be remiss in my duty as a creator and a fan if I didn't give you at least one more chance to back out, if you don't know how things go down from about the halfway point onwards. So, I'm going to count to 5, and then I feel like I've done my job correctly. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, you were warned. One of the central themes of Signalis is its focus on a time loop of some kind. This could be a somewhat meta-interpretation of what it means to be a character in a game, and we certainly feel some of that when we hit the game's fake-out ending. This is one hell of a ballsy move. I played one other game with a fake-out ending last year, but that one didn't even make it through the credits without letting it slide that all is not as it seems, while Signalis is more than willing to give you the full developer's credits. I mean, it's only 2 people plus a little extra help, and then kick you back to a version of the start screen where, hopefully, the subtle changes are enough to clue you into the fact that something isn't quite right. Even so, once you click that little continue icon, you are met with the exact same opening and sent back to the same starting room as you were in before. It's only when you start to explore the ship that things start to look different. What we are experiencing here is some kind of flashback or memory buried within our Elster unit of the life she had on her ship with Ariane, and what their ultimate purpose was on there. And if you thought things didn't make a lot of sense before, well, prepare to have your mind blown. Through exploring the ship and going about our daily routine, we come to discover that we are part of the Penrose Deep Space Exploration Program, and that we were fired into space with the mission of finding habitable worlds for colonization and ore extraction. Which begs the question, how in the hell did we wind up on a well-established mining colony within our home system? This whole section is a comfortable little respite from the contrasting oppressive silence and high-intensity industrial noise we experienced while we explored the Sierpinski 23 mining facility, and ends with the revelation that Ariane, far from treating her Elster as some kind of tool, has been, knowingly or unknowingly, working to bring out much more of her Gestalt side, and the two have formed a romantic relationship. We share a tender moment with them as they celebrate their 3000 cycle or 8-year anniversary, and are soon expecting new orders for their mission. This is probably the most we get to see of Ariane, and we see she's an artist and a painter, something not looked upon well in the society she grew up in. In fact, from other memories of hers we can catch a glimpse of, we can see that this girl didn't exactly feel very welcomed in her home society, which may explain why she'd volunteered to be catapulted into deep space with only a replica to keep her company, something I can kinda relate to myself if I'm being honest. This conflicts with so much of what we've been dealing with up to this point though. Didn't we crash land on Leng, a moon within our native star system? When did all this happen? And what is this promise that the game is constantly hounding us to remember? The 2 big aha moments come at the end of the game, first in the save room before the final boss fight. This room is called Home, and is clearly Ariane's old home from some time in the past. Time and space have long stopped making any logical sense at this point in the game. Here we find a letter that states Ariane, had she not been accepted into the Penrose program, would have been assigned to the Sierpinski 23 mining facility on Leng. So we are dealing with 2 intersecting or overlapping narratives. I won't say timelines exactly because that would require me to commit to the idea that all of this is really happening, and it's more likely we're dealing with something like a blend of reality, memories, and dreams of another life all bleeding into one. The final and most important document can be found on the Penrose when you return after the final boss fight with Volker. This document was the updated orders Ariane received not long after the tender moment we saw the two sharing. It stated simply that at this stage, their mission should be deemed a failure, and it will be only a matter of time before the radiation shielding in the ship fails, and Ariane will die from radiation poisoning. This letter stinks of rhetoric and straight-up bullshit. The idea that someone dying in the vacuum of space would be comforted by the fact they offered some great service to an uncaring nation is absolutely disgusting. The final part of this letter states that it may be advisable to instruct their Elster unit to end their lives quickly rather than let their suffering be dragged out. This is the promise we have been summoned to fulfill. When these orders finally came, Ariane's Elster wasn't a docile machine with a pseudo-personality anymore. She had awakened to so much of her Gestalt past, and she truly loved Ariane. She couldn't do it. She instead placed her in the ship's emergency cryo chamber before finally succumbing to radiation poisoning herself and shutting down. Ariane is still very much alive, or in some state of half-life, as the stasis chamber keeps her alive, but she retains some level of consciousness. This has led to a lot of speculation as to what is actually going on. It is quite possible that Ariane is bioresonant herself, leading some to speculate that her powers are calling out to the deactivated Elster, and our journey through the Nightmare Labyrinth is a kind of shared dream that ends with Elster finally reawakening to, hopefully, keep her promise. I'll be honest, this seems like the cleanest and simplest theory. It certainly explains a lot of the dream logic and symbolism that permeates all of the game. But it probably isn't that simple. Bioresonance is a lot less Professor Xavier and a lot more the Phoenix. The true Phoenix, I mean. A reality-altering cosmic entity with near godlike powers. So the idea that Ariane is literally changing the fabric of reality, or that our Elster isn't even her original Elster, well, I'm not actually here to deal with any of that today. I am here to simply deal with the heartbreaking realization of what all this was building towards. How much, if any, of this actually happened is much less important than the absolute tragedy of what happened to this girl. I guess we shouldn't expect anything less from a society that creates a literal slave caste of people with thoughts, feelings, and memories, and actively represses those to keep them subservient. Much like Silent Hill 2, the game ends based on how you play it, not which buttons you hit in the final room, and a fourth secret ending was eventually discovered and unlocked through an ARG, which many consider to be the canon ending, while others just think it adds another layer of confusion to the whole plot. So I'll finish this spoiler section by making a small correction to something I said earlier. Signalis is not a horror game. It's a romance and a tragedy. An utterly heartbreaking tragedy of two people exploited and thrown away by an uncaring society. There is some beauty to be found in the love they shared in their somewhat brief time together, but that only makes how it ended feel so much worse. I've finished Signalis twice now, and both times I found myself fighting back tears. Not just because the end is a tragedy, but because there wasn't any more to play. Rose Engine poured their heart and soul into making a game that was at once familiar and unique, that told its own story while taking time to pay homage to all of the other stories that inspired and paved the way for it. In the end, two people spent 8 years building a project out of passion, crafting a world that was dark and terrifying, and still found a moment to share with us real love and tenderness formed between two people in the direst of situations. This review barely scratches the surface of the lore and the so-called real meaning of everything we experience while playing it, but I hope I've made it very clear that this game is worth playing and a mystery worth exploring. This is my personal 2022 Game of the Year. Not just the best game that came out that year, but the best one that I played. It's a perfect example of survival horror done well, and stands toe-to-toe with the giants that came before it. I really hope there's more to come one day. Maybe not more of this. I'm a big believer that stories should end, and adding more to this particular narrative I think would only cheapen the conclusion. But more from this team, this world, this playstyle. Sign me up. because this was one hell of a good time. I hope you enjoyed our little exploration into esoteric space horror. It's a tragic tale where once again we, the players, turned up too late to do anything about it. I'm really enjoying all of the Signalis fan art that's been cluttering up my Twitter of late though. I'm now dividing my time between YouTube and learning Unity, so video production may slow down a bit. This is just a hobby though, and as long as it's fun, I certainly won't be giving up. I usually make a big deal about the next game at this point, but I've been looking ahead to March, where the release of Resident Evil 4 means that the algorithm will briefly align with my own interests, so I wanted to get ready for that and try to increase the reach of my content. I've been mulling over what to do for February, and I was initially going to dig up something old and janky, when on a whim I decided to dig out something from my backlog that kept the same theme of space horror, but did it in a cool immersive sim style, and it was quite a shock to my system. I will hopefully get everything ready for February, but if not, expect to be machine gunned with content in March, as I dive into the legend of Ethan Winters, OG Resident Evil 4, and Arcane Studios' Prey. Hope to see you there. Well, hey there you. Welcome back to my little happy place where I make my plans for world domination. I had a wonderfully relaxing winter vacation, and returning to work was something of a system shock. I hope you all had a good time. At the very least, I hope you found a few moments of peace in this crazy hectic world we live in. Thanks to all of you who keep coming back to say hi and see what I'm up to. I always appreciate your comments. Anyway, I'll take this moment when most people have already left to remind you that I have a Twitter, an Instagram, and the beginnings of a Facebook page that you can follow if you want. For now though, stay warm and safe, and I hope 2023 is your best year yet.